Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with Interfex 2018, presents Interfex Live.
Morning, New York.
Morning.
Welcome to day 2. Interfex Live. They got you, right? Got it. All right. Welcome to day 2. Interfex 2018, Experience Science Through Commercialization. So to lead off today, we got an exciting presentation about ASME BPE cabinet washers. So my first question is, why don't we talk about what ASME Bioprocess Equipment Task Group is? Pete, you want to handle that?
Sure. So ASME BPE, Hygienic Equipment Design Standards, has everything from the process side of things to clean equipment. So CIP has been a section that's been in there for now 10 or 15 years. The task groups take on individual sections. This task group was on cabinet washers, so addressing the manual cleaning that's going on for parts in the biopharm industry, and drafting some standards to help define not only what the equipment looks like, but what kind of process considerations should be made.
Okay. Where's my manners? I forgot to introduce the panel here. So we have Melissa from Merck, we have Albert from Advent Engineering, and we got Pete from Sani-Matic. Sorry about that. Forgot my manners there for a minute. Okay, so first question, Pete. How do the steps or phases of a cabinet washer, considering you left off on CIP, how do they compare?
Yeah, so I'll make a lot of analogies to CIP today, but CIP, so phases, pre-rinse, chemical washes. There could be multiple chemical washes or single chemical washes. Rinse after that to eliminate the chemicals from the system, and then a final rinse. So those stages or phases of a cabinet washer are the same as a CIP. There's added phases at the end, so typically drying steps at the end. So after you wash and clean those parts, there are also leftover water, residual water on the parts. So you need to go into some drying phases. Final steps, usually a cooling phase, so the parts can come out not hot to the touch, so operators can unload the racks that the parts are on.
So how does this cabinet washer, in the space that it's in, how does that interface with all the rest of the process?
Yep, so one of the first considerations is you have to look at your overall process. So there's two main designs of cabinet washers, so single door and double door pass-through designs. So if your design comes and your process parts are coming in on a dirty side, and you don't have space for coming through on the other side of a wall and going through a pass-through design, you're starting with a single door configuration. If you're able to, a lot of times the ideal situation is that the load side or the dirty parts come in on one side, go into the cabinet washer, it goes through a cycle of cleaning, and then the other side comes out clean. So those interfaces on the clean room, on the clean room side and the unload side, materials, so 304, 316, specification from the end user of what they're using in that grade of clean room, as well as weld finishes, RA, surface RA, all those considerations.
Right. So Melissa, I mean,
Yeah.
let's take it from your standpoint. It's like, what sort of parameters, what sort of conditions are needed so these things are controlled?
So you're going to control all the same things you would control in a CIP cycle. You need to understand the flow rate of your cleaning fluid, your WFI or compendial water, depending on your step, on your process. Your chemical conductivity, if you're using chemicals, you want to control the conductivity as a means of controlling chemical concentration. Obviously the length of time it operates, that's sort of a no-brainer. Albert?
Temperatures
Yeah, I knew
key.
I was forgetting one really important thing.
I mean, I want just to add to that, one thing about these cabinet washers are different than CIP. CIP is usually somewhere in a gray space. Right? These cabinet washers are part of your plant. I mean, the face of it is right there. And a lot of times that interface, like things like an exhaust vent, when you open the door, you have a lot of vapor comes out, and you have to make sure that doesn't prevent a situation where we could have mold or something like that.
Right.
So it's a little different that way, I think, than a CIP, because it's really part of your plant, and like Pete says, that it's right where your dirty parts come in and the clean parts would go out. Sometimes it's in the same area, but it could also be like a pass-through.
Yep.
Access to the maintenance space
Okay.
from your clean areas of your facility. You're accessing a dirty maintenance space,
Correct,
so you
yeah.
have to have those considerations how you're going to do that, where the bits and pieces of the washers are they usually underneath your equipment, so you need to allow for access to that,
Yeah.
which is tough.
can get
So-
tight in there.
Yep.
So, Melissa, I mean, while you're talking, so how does the cleaning components, how does everything get delivered? I mean, so in other words, this thing could be someplace remote as opposed to a CIP system, or so. But to me, how did the cleaning agents get in? All the other
Okay.
materials, stuff like that.
So there's a couple different ways you can deliver cleaning agents. You can do it locally from day tanks, but then that puts corrosive chemicals on your production floor, and you need to handle those. You need to have spill containment for that. Or you can, if you have this as part of an integrated facility, you can deliver those chemicals from somewhere else, somewhere in your utility area. You can have distribution of those chemicals, and that itself comes with different considerations. What sort of material of construction are you using for the piping to distribute those? How are you distributing those? How are you controlling the flow to each piece of equipment that gets those chemicals?
Yep, yeah, same thing. So you're talking about the chemicals coming in too, but same thing with the actual overall CIP systems and the tanks and everything. So cabinet washers could be completely standalone. So the actual cabinet is almost like a bioreactor tank, where instead of bringing the CIP to it, you're bringing the parts of that. But the CIP system itself, the recirculation pump, the instruments, all of that can be local to the cabinet washer, or it can be powered by a completely separate CIP cycles or a CIP system. So you can have a standalone CIP system delivering to the cabinet washer, and maybe even do other CIP processes, or it could be integrated into the cabinet washer.
I mean,
So-
just to add one thing, I think Melissa brings up a good point about the concentrated chemicals. That's probably the highest safety risk we have in this system, and so I think it's sometimes overlooked that people have to fill those. So either you have a distributed system where it's
Yeah.
automatically filled, or operators have to come and fill them. And then when they come and fill them, you don't want to have to open a gray space to fill them. And then, so you probably have something in a manufacturing space, and then you have to have a way to get it from the manufacturing space to where the washer is. Then you have to worry about double containment and things like that. So it's non-trivial, but just as long as you think about all the risks up front, it works out.
Well, it sounds to me, I think this kind of fits into other process aspects. It doesn't just come in a box. So, I mean, the answer is you got to consider the infrastructure. So, Pete, as a supplier or manufacturer in this area, I mean, when you deliver something to an end user,
Yeah.
what does this turnover thing look like? I mean, what kind of documentation, what parts, I mean,
Sure.
what sort of dialogue goes on, and what do you give them?
Yep, great question. So as first off, with the cabinet washers being in the BPE, there are some documentation requirements, GR5 in BPE, and basically all those documentation requirements of that for CIPs or process equipment applies to cabinet washers. So you're talking things like MTRs, weld logs, weld maps, validation documents, FATs, so factory acceptance tests at our manufacturer's site, where we are checking documentation, checking performance. Riboflavin testing is an important one. All of that. So all applicable turnover documentation to process equipment. Same kind of deal here for cabinet washers.
You say factory acceptance test. I mean,
Yep.
usually that's done at the vendor rather than on my facility.
Yep,
Is
yep.
that, yeah, okay.
Yep.
Then you do the install? Okay.
Yep.
All
Yep.
right.
Install site acceptance tests, IQ/OQs, all that.
Right. So, Pete, while we're on the topic, I mean, just so everybody's on the same page, I mean, it sounds to me like there's a lot of end user requirements. I mean, what else is involved? Racks, pieces? I mean, what else?
Yep. Yeah. Racks are vital. Yeah, they're Melissa's favorite, but they're vital. So I'll use the CIP analogy again. So CIP, everyone's familiar with cleaning tanks, right? So you're bringing in solution to, I'm going to give the example of a static spray ball, directionally drilled, say. So you have a bioreactor, you have ports here, you have agitators there. There's a certain orientation installation, correct installation for that spray ball. And how we do that is just a simple alignment pin, right? So it's a pin welded to the spray ball. There's a hole on the actual tank that kind of fits into. So every time an operator, maybe they take it out for their process, or maybe they take it out for cleaning inspection. When you put it back in, it goes in that same spot, and you're cleaning that tank the same way. So that's CIP. On the cabinet washer side, it's a little different. We're bringing the parts to the cabinet washer, but then this rack system or holding system, that's the critical, much more complex than the alignment pin, but a critical part of the overall system, because that's what's actually holding your parts in this orientation that can be sprayed and cleaned by the cabinet washers, that it's drainable, all of that. So it's a really key element.
Yeah,
And
Melissa, I
if
see
you're-
you chomping
yeah.
at the bit there.
Yeah,
so.
no, if you're cleaning carboys, if you're cleaning maybe small tanks, things of that nature, that's, I'll say, simple enough.
Yeah.
It's kind of straightforward enough. But if you have custom equipment, more complex equipment. That's something that you need to flag to your vendor, your cabinet washer vendor, as soon as you can. They're going to need, in order to be able to serve your needs, they're going to need to understand what you have to clean and what it looks like, what its geometries are. So there are, to go back to the FATs, and there's some performance testing that's generally expected in an FAT. But if you're running your procurement of your cabinet washers in parallel with your procurement of your other major equipment, there's going to be some lag time there. Because you're going to be waiting for your major equipment vendors to be giving you drawings of pieces, parts that you may want to wash in these cabinet washers, and those are drawings that your vendor of your cabinet washer, I'm going to use Pete, that Pete needs in order to build his rack, and that's going to have a lag time from when he gets those drawings to when he's able to deliver you a drawing or a proposal of a rack that can wash those pieces of equipment.
Yeah, so but yeah, part.
Well, as someone that interfaces with the end user, one thing that the end user likes to do or wants to do is wash every combination of every part, right?
Of course, yeah.
And so like this universal rack, which kind of doesn't really exist. But one thing that we found that's really helpful is parts don't usually get dirty randomly, right? They get dirty like when you do a certain operation. So we found that this idea of kitting or putting together certain parts that sort of get dirty together, they're going to want to be getting cleaned together, so that you don't have an infinite number of combinations. And I think it makes for the rack design a lot simpler and maybe even more robust.
Right. In my previous experience, we've done some of that by room, by unit operation, perhaps, and you're developing loads and a given load pattern based on your unit operations and your batch cycles.
Yeah, so Melissa talked about part information, you kind of mentioned it, grouping. So grouping is critical too. You could have a cabinet washer, you could have 5 different racks, and you give us a couple hundred parts. But you know, as a manufacturer, I don't know if these groupings go together or these groupings go together. So if you have to have correct grouping identification, so you don't have preloaded parts and really optimize the efficiency of the racks going through and minimize the time to clean.
Right.
So Pete, do you walk, like for an example, like would you and Melissa walk through the process so we get this, so you get her end use? Sounds to me like that's a pretty involved process.
It is. It can be.
Yeah,
But,
absolutely.
I mean,
you
I
have
think
to have good relationships with your suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but in my experience, a lot of times these are the sorts of things that get overlooked real quick.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I had, we talked about parameters. I forgot it. What is like the user interface instrumentation? What's that look like, Melissa? I mean, for example, what would you be expecting on your system?
Oh, it depends on your application. I mean, if you're putting this into a lab setting, something that's relatively straightforward in terms of automation is perfectly acceptable. I'm going to want to see, because of the configuration, because of what a cabinet washer looks like, I'm not really going to be able to see all of my instruments in place. It's all underneath or it's in the side of, right? So I'm going to have something, some screen that shows me those, usually in a PNID format. But we've accepted, Allen Bradley, Siemens, any of the common platforms, things like that. If it's a more integrated facility, it may be expected to interface with your electronic batch management systems, your electronic batch records, your distributed control system, your Delta V or your SCADA, whatever it is. It really depends on the application, the end user, where they're putting this in their facility and how they're integrating these wash cycles into their batch management.
It doesn't actually become part of the process, though, right? I mean,
it can be.
Okay, the reason I asked the question, Melissa, simply because you had noted about the batch record, but is it customarily part of that, or is that can we just, because my confusion,
I don't think so. I
don't think so, but it goes to part reuse, and
gotcha. Okay.
And it does become a record
right.
that is that the FDA can ask for.
Gotcha. Okay.
You better be able to link it to batch production too. I washed this part at this time, and that part served in either the preceding batch or the following batch, depending on what the investigation might be about. You're going to need to link those cleaning cycles in some way, be it paper log or electronic record. to your batch production. So maybe not part of the official batch record, but
Gotcha.
definitely logged.
That would make a lot of sense.
Well, what I was going to say, that the other interface is Pi or some kind of historian.
Sure.
So it's important to connect these systems that are validated to a historian so that you can review the records, because almost every one of these has some kind of a requirement to annually or some periodic revalidation or check to see if things are still working the same. And if they're not, at least you can go back and trend and see when things have changed. Those critical parameters that Pete were talking about earlier.
Okay, so why don't we start with that? And again, we'll kind of, we won't, let's bundle like the testing, the parameters, the validation, not the, we'll just kind of work through that.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll start with that. For example, from a supplier standpoint, what testing are you expecting to be done? All right.
Sure. So the most, I guess, there's first off, there's drainability of the chamber. So similar how you do a drainability report on a vessel, you want to make sure that the actual chamber that is being washed is drainable. But more importantly, so there's a couple different riboflavin testing aspects. So the cabinet washer itself. So you want to make sure that the surfaces of the roof of the cabinet washer with the potential to drip back on the parts, that's getting cleaned by the sprays inside the cabinet. And then also each rack configuration that you make, you want to do riboflavin testing on that rack to make sure that all the coverages of the sprays, there's two types of chamber sprays. So there's two types of sprays. There's chamber sprays, so it could be rotary sprays, oscillating sprays, static sprays within the chamber itself. And then most of the time, because you're cleaning these carboys and things with recessed areas, you have what's called an active rack. So when you load the rack into the chamber, it actually mates up with some kind of tubing or hygienic piping from the process. So the pump's able to supply solution and flow up into that rack. You might be flowing through valves that are connected to the active rack. You might be going through sprays. But those two types of sprays, you want to make sure all the parts inside, outside, have complete spray coverage, which is done through riboflavin testing.
Yeah, okay, so you bring up the riboflavin. So Albert, I mean, what areas, maybe, are there specific places or what is covered?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. First of all, does everybody know what this book is? Have they seen this book? ASME BPE? So that's kind of where we're referencing this whole task group that now in 2016, I think was the first time we had the cabinet washer section in there. And, Pete was the task group leader for that. So, we have a riboflavin test in here, in Appendix L. And what we try to say in the standard is what things to take exception to from that, because that's really for vessels. And I think that the biggest thing is, people ask this question about, how much riboflavin can you still see when you're done, right? Well, the real answer is none for product contact surfaces, right? And so that brings into the question, what's product contact surfaces? And then again, we go to great extent in defining what that is, but it basically
Albert did that.
Resolves around. It basically resolves around the idea that if it could have impact to the product, it's product contact. So when Pete says we're worried about the ceiling, and he didn't say anything about the floor, so maybe you could have some riboflavin on the floor because we don't necessarily consider that product contact. So anything that's product contact that could have impact to the product, whether it can drip on it or after you think everything's clean, that's product contact.
Melissa, did you want to build
No,
on that?
I think Albert
All right,
covered that adequately. I mean, I guess I did want to add, it does go back to when are your racks available to do your testing. Like I said, you may end up lagging some of that. And can you physically provide, Peter, the part?
Right.
In some cases you can. In some cases there's confidentiality or something of that nature that's preventing you from supplying those parts. I mean, it could be even just accelerated timelines. So there may be some level of risk that you need to accept and assess on your own as a company how you want to deal with that. Obviously, when you have everything at your site and you have all the parts from everything that you need, you can make those tests. But before you have that, can you really, can you do that? Can you do that at a particular vendor's shop? Maybe not.
Right.
And that's something that as a project team or an engineer implementing the equipment that you need to work through.
Let's get back to the drainability. Can we talk about that a little more?
Yeah, so there is a drainability test for vessels, and it basically involves filling the vessel and allowing it to drain without any assistance. And we require the same thing for cabinet washers. Cabinet washers come with pumps, so we're specifically say don't use the pump, and we want to make sure it drains. And of course, there's going to be some leftover surface tension liquid in the chamber, and there's a test where you supposed to displace the puddles, and then if they recoalesce again, it means you have a flat spot. So that test would be applicable to cabinet washers. We recommend at least 1/8 of an inch per foot slope for the bottom, and then the racks, all the process piping that's in there, that all has to be drainable as well, and the pump. So everything, just like a CIP system, all those requirements would be applicable.
I got you. So coming back to you, Pete, I mean, you're building this thing. So what design and fabricate? Sounds to me like there's a lot. So why don't we just walk through those key steps? In other words, not everybody's going to be, Melissa or Albert. I mean, you got to walk them through it. So what's the triage here?
Melissa kind of hinted at part availability. So ideally, you know all your parts at the start of the project. That's not ideal, but it's not real, I should say. But that is ideal because you can know how long you have to clean. You can kind of figure out your chamber size, and we're going to need a bigger chamber, a smaller chamber. But regardless, you identify some kind of chamber size for how many parts you have. But then in the part information. We get the groupings and the information of what parts are from the end users. That could be through drawings, that could be through modeling on site or at our facility. And then in that consideration, our job as a manufacturer is really to determine the rack design to make those parts drainable, so make the parts in an orientation that are both drainable and all the cleaning solution is accessible to all the surfaces. So that's kind of the job of the manufacturer. We get the part groupings, and that's definitely not there's not a fine line of responsibility of both of that. It's a lot of back and forth for approval on that.
So maybe what we should do is walk through that. So in other words, this dialogue, it's in the standards now. But this is something that also has to be talked through with the supply or the user, no? Or yes?
I'm not sure exactly what we say. We struggle with forcing dialogues into the standard. We usually get a lot of pushback when we try to put in wording like the end user and manufacturer must agree on this or must discuss that. There's usually a lot of pushback because in some places, I think in California, this is part of the fire code, which sort of brings it in lightly as code, which is different than a standard. The standard is a guideline; it's a recommendation. So it's awfully hard to insist that you have this discussion, but certainly that's recommended.
Yeah, I think it's the overarching is racks need to hold the parts. It must be a repeatable process, right? So we need in the end, it just needs to be repeatable. The path to get to that is long and laborious, but in the end, the racks need to be a repeatable process for the parts.
I got it.
I would say most of the places where we say end user and manufacturer should agree, it's places where we can't say exactly how it needs to be, right? So if it's sometimes one way or sometimes another, right, that's when we sort of try to leave it up to agreement between them.
Yep.
All right, so let's talk about that for a minute. So we talked about the cleaning elements, we talked about the chemicals. Let me ask you, so what sort of input do you give on like final rinses, for example?
Yep, so final rinses can be done a couple different ways. So recirculate final rinse, so just dosing with water, WFI or whatever water type you're using for your final rinse, and then recirculating within the cabinet, so not going to a drain step. In that case, you are looking for either conductivity or time or TOC for a final use water quality acceptance. You can also do single pass final rinses, so in that case you can do a couple different ways. You can come in with a direct utility connection, or you can do a water break tank. So filling up a tank with your water and then going once through over the parts and then to drain. In any case, however you do it, you need to have that final rinse. The hydraulic conditions of that final rinse need to be consistent across all the phases. So we talked about pre-rinse, washing, final rinses. If you're doing 150 GPM during your recirculation of your chemical wash, it's not really adequate to spray 10 GPM on it at the end, because we want to not only clean all the surfaces of the parts with the chemical wash, we need to take off all the chemicals the same way. So consistent hydraulic conditions, flow pressure is critical, which sometimes is harder with a direct utility connection. You don't often have a 150 GPM of maybe the utility water coming in, whereas with a recirculated rinse, you're basically all doing it from that same recirculation pump, so it's a lot easier to achieve that.
So by water, we're talking, WFI.
Yep.
We're talking, yeah. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. water quality that's specified by the end user what they want. They want to use a lower grade water
Gotcha.
quality for the chemical washes. But
Gotcha.
the final rinse is typically their highest grade water quality.
Okay. So what other utilities, Melissa? Say when he fabricates, like heat exchangers, dryer, what do you spec out?
Well,
What-
the heat exchanger technology is really up to the manufacturer,
Yep.
what we use, but definitely it's got to be something that doesn't interfere with the cleanliness of the product. I've seen immersion type
Yep.
heaters powered by, with steam, and as long as that steam is isolated from the water from the inside of the chamber, from any of the parts, that's perfectly
That's okay.
fine.
End users telling you're saying we have steam or we have electric, and then the manufacturer is deciding what type of.
But the type of heat exchanger doesn't matter.
Nope, doesn't matter as long as it doesn't impact the ability of the machine to keep the parts clean.
Yeah, I mean, again, we basically say it needs to meet section 3.6 or whatever of the BPE. So there's a whole section in the
Right.
BPE on heat exchangers.
Yeah.
So any hygienic heat exchanger that's drainable and cleanable is acceptable for this application. But it has to be hygienic.
So let's talk, while we're on the subject though, let's talk, for example, in other words, we talked about the heat exchangers. For example, the type of pumps that go into this thing. Is that something, again, that you spec, or is that something that the manufacturer specs? What's the
Again,
deal?
Yeah, it's the same thing. As long as it's hygienic, it's all right, because the pump itself becomes the product contact, because that's what all the cleaning chemicals are coming through. That's what my final rinse water might be coming through.
Yep, potentially.
So there's definite product contact issues there. So you need a pump that's hygienic. I don't remember the section number exactly. Maybe.
For pumps? No, I
Yeah,
don't either.
yeah. But there's a section on pumps too.
Yeah.
That are.
No, I get that. So
acceptable,
what kind
you
of
know.
pumps are we talking? We talk piston pumps?
Centrifugal pumps.
Centrifugal?
Mostly is what
Yeah.
that's what I've seen.
Yeah.
That's.
Yeah, so we're
what
not
I've
talking
seen.
high pressure pump.
No. Usually you're running in the 40, 50, 60 psi range. Same
Okay.
for these centrifugal pumps.
Okay, so piston pumps are out. I got
Yeah.
it. Okay, good.
Most likely.
But just to make the point that Peter was talking about how you can go, the final rinse can come from a utility or it can come from the pump. So it's a little easier to control if it comes from the pump, because the
Yeah.
pump is
Absolutely.
designed to give you the same flow rate every time, right?
Right.
When you go from the utility, especially if it's a Wi-Fi system, you don't know who's on it, so you don't know if you're the last
Right.
guy on the loop and you get what's left, or you have some way of controlling pressure. So I think even though you have a choice, I mean, and the standard says you could do it either way, but you need if you do use a utility system like a direct connection, you have to make sure it can't backflow into that system, and you have to make sure that you can control the pressure, so that you get the same pressures that you did those riboflavin tests that
Yep,
we
absolutely,
described earlier.
But isn't this problem the same if you have a capacity issue, whether the pump's connected to a standalone Wi-Fi?
No, because the pump can generate the pressure. It just needs a volume, and it will
Right.
have that in the
Yeah.
surge tank. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you starve the pump, you're still out of business, right?
Well, but that's only if it's once
Yeah.
through.
If
Yeah,
I'm
that's what
starting
I
the
meant.
pump,
Yeah, if it's once
something's
through,
gone
you could run out.
Gotcha.
If you
Okay.
run out of water,
going
yeah.
out.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. Maybe I
But you
misunderstood.
can batch it and then run it,
Yeah.
and then batch
You
it
know,
and then run it.
you're talking to an old process guy. The guy tells me he's got 3 machines. Yeah, I can run them all at once. I take it for granted. Well, how come number 3 doesn't want to run? Well, I don't have enough steam. What? You know what I mean? You told me they run. You know. Anyway, I digress. You know. But I'm saying, I mean, that just so I get a sense of it. All
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
So, while we're talking about sprays, let's talk about what type of sprays are we talking about?
Yep. Yeah, I mentioned earlier. So kind of 2 groupings of sprays. You can either have chamber sprays. So that's if you take the rack out of it for a second, look at the sprays inside the chamber. So generally, rotary sprays, oscillating sprays. They could be fluid driven. They could be mechanical driven as well, or static sprays, just spray ball or spray nozzle. So it could be in the chamber, or we could have rack sprays. So I talked about kind of for a second that sprays going up inside the rack and process connections there. If you do have rotating sprays or oscillating sprays, any sprays that move, you want to verify rotation. So you want to have proc switches or some means of ensuring that if you have, say, an oscillating spray, that spray is actually spraying. If you were to gall up and that spray bar was kind of stuck, you couldn't really tell if you're just monitoring flow and pressure, because you could be getting the same flow and pressure out of those sprays, but you're galled up on the rotary, so you don't really know, and you're not getting coverage where you would when you did the riboflavin test.
Right.
So you want to make
Gotcha.
sure that those sprays are going through proc switches or other means of verification.
Gotcha. So, from an end user standpoint, what?
I mean, the sprays are what that's up to Peter, and
Yeah,
it's I can typically in my tanks it's a lot harder to get rotating spray.
Right.
To implement that, my validation group usually throws up their hands and gets very excited about that. In the parts washers, typically it's a little bit easier to implement. There's definite ways to confirm that these things are rotating at the same as they were during the validation cycles. But your technicians, especially if it's fluid driven, your technicians are going to have to do checks on these things, and they're going to have to be regular. It's going to be based on the frequency of use, but they're going to have to be able to get in there. They're going to have to be able to take it apart easily enough to inspect. If it's fluid driven, they're going to have pinholes that drive the arms, and they're going to have to check and make sure that those aren't blocked. I mean, you are doing cleaning, right? We get stickers, you get bits and pieces of gloves, bits and pieces of O-rings, all kinds of neat stuff. That sometimes by magic will find its way into your distribution system within the washer, internally into the washer. So they have to be able to go in there and look at these things and see what's going on in there. So that's a consideration when you're putting these things in your facility, to make sure that your technicians can get in there easily. I have run into that where the filter screen is against a wall.
Right.
I open the door and now I can't get to my filter unless I crawl over the door and into the washer, which is a non-ideal situation. That was something we learned the hard way. But I can't fix it when it's in there.
Right. Absolutely.
So you're talking about like a strainer?
Like a strainer in
to
the
capture
cabinet,
some of these things?
Yeah.
And that's why we don't have a strainer yet in here.
Right.
But
Well,
we
it's
have
a strainer in the cabinet.
No, but we're trying to get it in, right?
So one of the things I think we I was remiss. We talked about drainings. We talked about puddling. I mean, what is the inside? What kind of a finish did we put on the inside of this thing? So, Albert, I mean, what do we do? I mean, it's a never-ending debate, at least on my side.
Well,
so
first
what
of
is it
all,
going to be?
it doesn't have to be electropolished. That's number one.
So, okay, so we take the top of the.
You don't
top.
have to, but most do.
Most do.
Most do. They want it to look shiny.
They want to look pretty. Okay,
Yeah.
I got it.
So, I mean, it's a typical RA that you'd find for product contact equipment. So we usually leave that up as an agreement between the end user and the supplier, but usually the end user has a specification.
Perception is reality. Like when they see something that doesn't look shiny, they're gonna. How do I know that's clean? It doesn't look clean.
Yeah.
It may or may not be really required for that, but when it looks clean, when it looks shiny.
Yeah.
I mean, some QA groups like it shiny so they can see. So.
It's interesting because normally we focus on internal surfaces, right? But in a washer, there are some external surfaces that are actually product contact also, right? Let's say there could have some piping in there as part of the rack, and the external surface has product contact surface, so that has to be polished as well. So it's not just looking at the internal piping.
So let's, I mean, while I was thinking about that, so I wanted to get back to, you said, well, the drain's in, the drain's out. So and poor Melissa's climbing over the door. So what's the hardest spot? I mean, if you had to go and you tell Pete, what really stinks? This part about cleaning it. What would that be?
So there's a number of parts in the parts washer design that are not ideal for cleaning, and those things that have threads. So I've seen parts washers that have tri-clamps, which are hygienic for the inside, but they're not hygienic for the outside. And so again, in the standard, we say to avoid that. But we don't tell them not to because we think it might not be practical to completely eliminate it. But the idea is at least to try to place them in places where we don't need them to be clean. And if they do need to be clean, and it could be other things like pulleys and wheels and stuff like that, we basically specifically say they should be targeted for cleaning. So that's a place that you would definitely look for residual riboflavin, either riboflavin test.
Okay. So you had talked about pulleys, wheels, so these things have to be lubricated. What do we do then?
Well, again, we say that you shouldn't use lubricants that are either in product contact or could drip onto product contact, so that's kind of the same definition. So again, where these have to be, if they are wheels and so on, they probably should be under the rack as opposed to above the rack.
Right.
So did you find that as a problem when you designed the systems?
Well, I mean, it's sometimes we come in after it's designed. Sometimes we come in before. After it's designed, we have found problems with parts washers that didn't think that part through. It
Wow.
just limited their scope to, let's say, trying to clean the part itself. And then we do a riboflavin test and we see a drop, and it's clear that it got cleaned, but that's not where the drop came from, right? The drop came from somewhere else.
I gotcha. So these doors that you talked about, I mean, do these doors swing out, swing back? What are we talking about, Melissa?
Yeah,
So,
go
the
ahead.
ones I'm
Either-
most familiar with swing down, but I've seen ones that kind of slide open. I imagine there's ones that pull open kind of like your refrigerator door,
Yep,
although,
absolutely.
depending on the size, that might not be so convenient.
Yeah.
They need to seal. That's really the most.
So what's
the key.
preferred?
There is. It's whatever really works with your layout, I think. You got a small space. You're not going to want a door that swings down and
Right.
takes up that whole space, or swings out and takes. But then again, the door when it swings down, so that can be a way to get your rack in, a way
Right.
to support the rack going into the washer.
Yep, there's all different ways that
As
you
a,
can
so what would you say is the predominant design? Have you seen?
swing, some method of swing. So swing side hinge, swing down is probably the most common.
As opposed to sliding?
Sliding, you can do sliding. If you're sliding vertical, you're looking at clearances above where that door is going into. You're also potentially worried about maybe that door sliding into a maintenance area, which isn't as controlled as your clean room side.
Yeah, I think like a blind slide. It just seems to me that would be another opportunity to bring in the magical
Sure.
occurrence of other
Yeah.
material.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Sure.
So, I think. So, what about drying? I mean, what about air and stuff like that? The drying source. So, Albert, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we recommend that we use HEPA filtered air, pre-filtered and HEPA filtered air for drying. You could use process air. It's a lot of air,
Right.
so people try to avoid that. But it should be, I call it clean, dry air, but really what we mean is low particulate air. So usually the design has some HEPA filter configuration in the air system.
Right, static pressure,
It's nominal. It's
Nominal.
nominal. Yeah.
and its return.
Return also has to, we're probably going to have moisture, so you have to have a way to get rid of the moisture. Low point drains, potentially in the ducting as well, to make sure you
Gotcha.
don't have residual moisture puddling.
When you say, so we're assuming the exhaust side has a condenser? Or?
So there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can do a single pass air. So if in that case you're coming in with the clean, dry, low humidity air, it's going into the chamber. Water's evaporating, you're taking the moisture off of those parts, it's going to the exhaust, and then you're going to building your exhaust, right? So you're just really losing the moisture in that case. So that's a common one. If you start talking about a lot of volume of air and you don't want to have that makeup, you can do recirculation. But as you said, then you're looking at condensing
Right.
that humidity out before you introduce it back, so you don't put the humidity back into the
Yeah.
parts.
Now, I just wanted to make sure that with the group what we're talking about, it gets that straight. I
Yep,
mean,
yep.
I don't want somebody to get into this debate about they got to condense their exhaust there.
Yeah, right,
Okay.
yep.
But it really depends on the way
Depends
you're
on
going
the
to use it.
recirculation, yep.
So, what for source air again? The recommendation is HEPA filtered sourcing.
Yeah, I mean, you can take it from in the room. A lot of times that's done. And again, it
Keep that in
depends on
mind
the.
with your HVAC design.
I was going to say, exactly. You got to make sure it doesn't affect the room pressurization. Or you can take it from outside the room, as long as, it goes through HEPA filtration.
Gotcha. So, Melissa, from a critical utilities, the answer is what sort of what ability does the facility have to accommodate? Anything unique? I mean, in other words, other than clean steam, water, is there anything that
Again, your chemicals, you might consider your chemicals a utility, and handling of those. Again, we touched on the safety there. Your water quality is really up to you and your regulatory or QA department. Usually the final rinse is WFI, but for your washes, for your initial rinses, you may be able to get away with the lower quality water. That's an analysis that needs to be done by the project team, by what do you have available. Sometimes it's more expensive to have more than one quality water, so I've seen places where they use WFI for all of it.
Yep.
And that's something that that your vendor has to know. What do you have available? because he's got to manage it differently.
Right.
You know, I'm not going to put WFI in through the same. I might not put it in through the same nozzle. You know, so, there's
So what
no,
sort of volumes are we talking about typically?
It depends. I mean,
Yeah, it all depends on cabinet washer size, but I mean, water, you could be in the small, in the 10, 15 gallons per cycle. And then you're looking at pre-rinse phase, so up to 100 gallons, all the way up to if you are doing a very large cabinet washer, if you did a single pass final rinse, you'd be talking a lot of water with separate
right.
tanks.
I mean, the final rinse can be a real water hog,
Yep.
depending
Yeah.
on what
Circulation
you've
there.
got. You know, if you're using a brake tank, you've only got a limited time for that rinse,
Yeah.
and you may need to build in multiple
Multiple
final rinses just to get the contact time that you need.
Yeah, again, the reason I ask is, later is not the time to find out you need 10 times the amount of whiff feed and your system can
Sure.
withdraw. Well, just
Sure.
to get a sense.
And that-
But again, isn't that all balanced by the end? I mean, you got to decide how you want to go about it.
Right, and we've got to rely on their expertise too to when we give them the groupings and they know what kind of size washer we're looking at to give us back some, we've been doing this for a while. This is where we're the experts. Is we can tell you this is how much water we think you're going to be using.
Yep.
What, just as a curiosity, what sort of, other than our industry, what other industries go to this technology?
So the cabinet washers?
Yeah.
Very, very typical in the food and beverage industry
Food and
as
beverage,
well. Yeah. So processing equipment, cheese manufacturers, shredded cheese, a lot of filling lines, right? So same kind of cabinet washers, different standards, different considerations, different requirements, but same concept, bringing the parts to the cabinet washer, racks holding systems for the parts.
I mean, a car wash is a cabinet washer, really.
Yeah.
You ever been in a car wash? Everybody's been in a car wash, right?
Yeah.
That's a cabinet washer.
Sure. I never thought about that.
Yeah. One doesn't normally
But
consider
we
that.
won't
but
build
yeah.
one, though.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
Now that uses some water, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. These are excellent.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you.